Welcome all. I'm John Sullivan. I'm mayor of Washington, Virginia. How many of you have been to this event before? So quite a few, but many of you haven't. My wife does. Welcome to Washington, or Little Washington, as it is often called. Much debate about that subject, but the local newspaper did a long article a couple weeks ago proving that this town had been called Little Washington back in the 1850s. So there's been a little tension as to whether it's appropriate to call Little Washington or not, but call it whatever you wish. Welcome to Washington and to Rappahannock. This is the brainchild of a number of people, but not the least of which is John Henry, who is a resident, along with Ann, of this county, 15 minutes from here, and also DC. And they have been doing this, dare I call it show? That seems somewhat diminishing what it is. First they did it during a Christmas parade we had here about 4 years ago on a flatbed truck. And then we decided to move it to the town hall here. And it really is an extraordinary, lots of fun. Quick word about the town hall, which we're often asked about. This was a church. It was built in 1857. And for reasons that are unknown to me, in the 1850s, it was a boom town, Washington, Virginia. And so an architect by the name of James Powers built this building, Trinity Church down here, and most of the buildings along the Courthouse Road. And there was a lot of development going on in the town of Washington. It was a Presbyterian church for about 50 years. And they finally, when they discovered that they had only 2 members left in the church, they decided to close it. And it sat empty. This is sort of ridiculous. This building sat empty for something like 50 years. And then in the 1960s, a group of people got together and refurbished it, took down all the trees and weeds around it, turned it into the county library. And it was a county library for 10 or 12 years, 15 years, whatever. And then for the last 10 or 12 years, it's now the town hall. So a little bit of quick background. George Washington was quoted as saying, "Associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation. It is better to be alone than to be in bad company." Well, we're clearly in very, very good company, and I hope I didn't mess up one of your lines. I can't. But that is clearly what we have here. Let me just, before we get started, turn it over to John Henry. In previous years, a most wonderful gentleman by the name of Kevin Gans portrayed George Washington. And those of you who have been here in the past, that was the George Washington that we saw for the last 3 or 4 years. And Kevin, sadly, I just learned, passed on about 2 weeks ago. And he was a wonderful fellow, and he loved coming here, and loved the town of Washington, loved doing this thing. And I looked up just something a second ago, and apparently Washington himself, when talking about death, described death as the abyss from where no traveler is permitted to return, which is a really pretty good line. And so, if you don't mind, let's just have a 15 seconds of silence, which means I'll shut up and the rest of you will continue to be silent, and just acknowledge what Kevin did here for a number of years. And with that, may I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate the kind words. We wanted to welcome everyone for coming today to celebrate George Washington's birthday. George, happy birthday.
So much.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday. George was the founder of our country. I'm going to introduce the founders now. On my right is Bob Randolph, who's going to play Edmund Randolph from Virginia, the second governor of Virginia. I'm playing George Mason. Travis Brown is playing George Washington. Bill Nitze is true to Alexander Hamilton in more ways than you can imagine. Bruce Fein, also James Madison. You've probably seen Bruce and different times, and we're delighted from Boston coming down today is James Otis, who created the intellectual property that made the Fourth Amendment possible. James, thank you for coming. What we thought we'd do today is celebrate, George, your leadership, and we would focus on the 8 years during the American Revolution, where you led us to victory. So from the Declaration of Independence in July 4th until the Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd, 1783. And then we're going to spend most of the time on the 5 months at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. They went up in April, and it went on, and went through the summer and ended in September 17th, to be exact. And then we're going to touch on the 8 years when George came back as President of the United States for 8 years. We'll deal with that in the Q&A. So we'll have take about an hour. We'll have half an hour question and answer, and we'll cover the 8 years of the presidency there. So George, you were first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of your countrymen. Everyone who's here today is deeply indebted to you. General Washington, you led us to victory over the British. It was a dicey experience, to say the least. It certainly, you were the first to admit, it didn't get off. It got off to a very rocky start. In fact, you lost 90% of the troops in the first 6 months by fighting the British straight up. But you came within a hair's worth of losing the war in New York. But General, you're to be complimented on being flexible. By switching to an asymmetric strategy, you were able to take New Jersey back in a series of brilliant military actions and engagements. And there's one thing that's absolutely certain, and that is that we would not have won our independence when we did without the time we did, without your leadership. So thank you, General.
Thank you, General.
And thank you, General.
Thank you, General.
Thank you.
You were without equal among those who acted in the theater of the Revolution.
I shiver every time I think of the General, me as his aide, and the other soldiers crossing the Delaware and spending the winter freezing at Valley Forge.
George, you and I spent many happy years trading ideas about farming on our Virginia plantation.
And George, I always admired you for being the author of the first Declaration of Rights. If you hadn't written it for the state of Virginia, I don't think Thomas Jefferson would have been able to draft the Declaration of Independence for the 13 colonies. Virginia led the way in declarations, and that was thanks to you. You are entitled to the eternal gratitude of mankind. I was only a man of action, but you are a man of words. True.
George, after you beat the British, many wondered whether you would appoint yourself king. Some hoped you would do this because Congress had failed to pay your troops, and Congress being Congress was in general disarray. General, you showed your character in resigning your commission and returning to Mount Vernon. You rejected overthrowing our government and becoming an American monarch.
And all of Europe was stunned by your decision and humility. They had remembered Alexander the Great, Caesar Augustus, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon, and couldn't conceive that someone with the opportunity for a limitless power would turn aside such authority and kingship. And for that, the entire country owes you additional gratitude.
General, you were exhausted after 8 years of fighting up and down the East Coast. Those 8 years of absence placed enormous strain on your marriage. Martha was very glad to have you back in Mount Vernon. and you got a 4-year vacation for public service.
General, we are going to convene in Philadelphia in this spring. 4 years under the Articles of Confederation have demonstrated that if we continue down that path, we will become unglued as a nation. The Articles of Confederation are deficient because there's no opportunity to raise revenue. It depends upon the volunteer dispensation of the states, that there is no courts that directly affect the people of the United States to ensure our treaty commitments are honored. There's no ability to regulate commerce that is promoting all sorts of internecine and parochial disputes between the states. Foreign countries are pitting one state off against another. Unanimity is required because each state retains its sovereignty under the Articles of Confederation. They were finally ratified in 1781, and if we do not revise the entire dispensation, all that we won at the Revolutionary War will be lost.
Oh my goodness. You are so persuasive. I've enjoyed every minute of my last 4 years at Mount Vernon and cannot contemplate giving that up lightly. There's too much for me to do here to take time to be in Philadelphia. It's always a 2-week journey, more than a 2-week journey by horseback, and no telling how long such a, what do you call it, convention would last.
Mr. Washington, General Washington, if you are not there and this convention fails, you will not live for the ages, and all of your handiwork will go up in smoke. Think of that. You're a man who has already caused Europe to be awed by your splendor, tenacity, and character. Don't surrender that opportunity to leave footprints in the sands of time.
James, your eloquence with words exceeds my own, but I have to say I am no expert like you and George Mason. You don't need me at this flamboyant.
We do need you, and are you worried that the convention would fail even with your presence and you don't want to be associated with failure? But the articles have already proven to fail. There's no downside to attendance.
Am I fearful that the undertaking will be a failure?
Yes, that's exactly what I've asked.
Then the answer would be yes.
Well, one thing, well, there's always risks in life. But one thing is clear, without your presence, the likelihood of failure will increase manyfold. Without your presence, everyone will fear a return of monarchy. Only you can elicit the trust and confidence that integrity will govern the proceedings rather than Machiavellian maneuvers for additional power. And without your presence, the dynamic that's needed to bring us together will fail.
My dear Miss Madison, you are such a persuasive fellow that I can imagine one day you would be president. Under the circumstances, you give me no choice but to accept.
So I devoted months in Princeton studying about every confederation in the history of mankind, based upon books that Thomas Jefferson had sent across the ocean from Paris when he was serving as our minister there. And although the task will be difficult and arduous, I am confident that given learning, understanding, and mastery of human nature, we can devise a constitution that will set a standard to which the wise and honest can prepare. I have drafted the Virginia plan.
Thank you, Mr. Madison. General, as governor of the state, our native state, I feel a special responsibility. We gave more in treasure. We gave more in leadership. We risked more than the citizens of any other state. We are the largest state. We have more people, and we are the wealthiest state. We are the state that risks being disadvantaged by a shift of power to the federal government more than any other. We must figure out a way of allocating power between the states and the federal government so that we do not lose our place in this polity. Now, Mr. Madison has very, very generously asked me to open the convention and present the Virginia plan, which he so articulately drafted. But I think I must defer to you, General, because you're the only person who can put this plan through this convention.
Mr. Randolph, again, you're very kind, but no, I am the presider at this convention. It would be wholly inappropriate for me to appear to prefer one plan over another. I ask that you introduce the
Well,
plan.
I understand that, General, but I do think we all need to understand that the hardest question we have to face is how we divide power between the executive and the legislature, the federal executive and the federal legislature. Can we talk about that?
Yes and no. I'd like to get into the details later, Mr. Randolph. I made it to Philadelphia in less than 2 weeks in the best of weather. This is hardly that. I wish there were a faster way to get there. I wish we had a new capital, perhaps one closer to Mount Vernon.
I would very much agree.
A place to start. You know, I have some land in mind across the Potomac River that I would like to tell you about later. But let's move on with the pragmatics of the situation.
Godspeed, General. I trust that the other states will go along with the Virginia plan and do not undermine our sovereignty, our native state sovereignty.
Wind blows.
I call the convention to order.
Thank you for selecting me. Thank you for selecting me president of the convention. I beg that you forgive my lack of experience, my uneven accent and elocution. I also pray you recall that all proceedings must be kept entirely in secret, as we have enemies who seek to undermine these processes and wish for our failure. We cannot go on with the Continental Congress. It churns out valueless paper money, not worth the Continental, people say. We need a new form of government. We need a federal government. We need to draft a new constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. I call on Edmund Randolph to read the Virginia plan.
This Virginia plan, General, represents the best thinking of all those political philosophers throughout the age who have thought long and hard about how to have a Republican form of government that also protects the liberties of the people and will not descend into monarchy and tyranny. These ideas come from such people as John Locke and Monsieur Montesquieu, and they're talking about separation of powers. That is separating and dividing powers among the many branches of government so that we don't have a king or an emperor who has all the power in his hands. And that's what we are about here. We need a plan that will provide for the common defense and the general welfare without subverting the liberties of the people. May I rise, gentlemen? I'll read the plan. Mr. Madison made some notes for me, and I do want to make sure that I read them out exactly.
Please do.
Now, we are going to divide power among a national legislature. We're going to have two branches. I'll talk about that later. A national executive and a national judiciary. The House of Representatives will be elected by the people. It will be the grand depository of the democratic principle. And then we'll have a Senate. That's the second branch of the legislature. Maybe some wiser people will be in it. And they will also be elected by the House of Representatives. And then we will have a national executive. We do need an executive authority because we lack that under the Articles. And that executive will be elected by the legislature, General. And the federal government will have the right to negate any state legislation that may contradict what's in this document that we are drafting or our national legislation. And then finally, we will have a national judiciary with one supreme tribunal. And that's the Virginia plan.
Thank you, Mr. Randolph. The Virginia plan calls for a federal government that respects the sovereignty of the states. Congress has more power, much more power than the president. Not one person here, not one of us, wants a democracy. Even here in Philadelphia, mobs threaten violence. Democracy is mob rule.
True enough. We need to remember that you can have tyranny by the majority as well as tyranny by one or tyranny by a few. If every Athenian citizen was a Socrates, a collection of them all would still be a mob. Remember Shays' Rebellion. Look at the situation in Rhode Island, where with pure democracy, you're getting laws that upset debtor-creditor relations. The mutability of the laws are detriment to economic growth and fairness, protecting expectations. That's what comes with unfiltered democracy. We must avoid the kind of direct election of a president that could lead to a Caesar Augustus or a Napoleon. And that is why in this particular dispensation, the president shall be dependent upon the Congress of the United States, with no disrespect for the president of this proceeding.
Hear, hear.
That doesn't make any sense. You can't believe in a strong American nation that will survive as a beacon of liberty to the world and want a strong federal government with a weak president. We must have both a strong federal government and a strong president. The states, at least with respect to those powers which any self-respecting national government must have, should be subordinated to such government. We need to concentrate considerable power in the hands of the executive to get things done. The president must be elected by the people and should have a term for life. Unless the president has independent authority separate from the Congress, the federal government will not be strong enough to ensure the survival of this nation. Now,
Over my dead body.
look, I know that many people in this room say that I'm advocating a king. And I also know that the Declaration of Independence, which we declared in 1776, contains in detail a bill of particulars of the misdeeds, oppressions, and injustices committed against us by George III and his government. And I stand by that great document and the cause of liberty which it contains.
If that's what you mean by a new constitution, I'm an anti-federalist. My dear friend Patrick Henry wouldn't come. I tried to get him to come to Philadelphia, but he smelled a rat. I promised Patrick that I'd do everything in my power to protect the sovereignty of Virginia. To be blunt, even the Virginia plan makes me feel nervous. We can't go any further than the Virginia plan in making the federal government stronger and have any hope of ratification. You, Mr. Hamilton, would abolish the states. Let's take a vote right now before we go any further. Does anyone here believe as Hamilton in the Hamilton plan as opposed to the Virginia plan? Does anyone here want as strong a federal government and as strong as an executive as Mr. Hamilton? Anyone?
And I want to remind Mr. Hamilton, we won the Revolutionary War without an executive branch at all. It was under the Articles of Confederation that had no executive at all. And we won the Revolutionary War against the largest and most powerful empire in the world. How can you claim that we are destined for destruction without some omnipotent executive branch?
Your idealism, Mr. Madison, is going to make sure that we lose a game where we just won. I know I'm alone in this room. I know that I'm basically wasting my time. I'm going back to New York to practice law. If you were able to come up with something better than the Articles of Confederation, I'll help with ratification. If we can get the states to go along, I'll be back to serve our first president, my mentor, the great General Washington. But before I leave this assembly, I want to leave you with a last word. You may think we live in some Edenic paradise with beautiful forests and running rivers and pretty mountains like the Shenandoah out here. And that we can pursue our own schemes of structured liberty unmolested by people outside us. I have some news for you. There are European powers, not least of which is Great Britain, from whom we in theory just won our independence, who would love to recapture that liberty, carve up our lands, and once again put them under their control. And the only way that we are going to be able to prevent this from happening is in part to emulate George III and his ministers and create a government that can truly defend our interests. But since you don't seem interested in that, I'm leaving.
Displaying the peevishness of a child.
You were the child, and you were about to pay the price.
Hamilton forgets why we had a revolution. We're not about to replace one king with another. There isn't a Whig bone in that man's body. An elected president is an elected monarch. An elected monarchy is more dangerous than what we just had, an English monarchy. Let's have several co-presidents.
Yes, a single president would be the fetus of monarchy.
You're crazy.
That motion is defeated, not the one just stated from the audience, but the motion for several co-presidents is defeated. There will be only one president.
Well, General, at the very least, we should limit the president's term in office to one term. We need term limits. Otherwise, we're moving down the road to monarchy again and having a president who will subvert our liberties and the power of Congress.
Mr. Randolph, having considered your motion, it is also defeated. There will be more than one term for the president.
We must be able to fire the president easily. Can you imagine how quickly my Virginia plantation would go to hell if I couldn't fire our farm manager?
We should place the impeachment and removal power in the House of Representatives, the tribune of the people.
I rue the day Congress doesn't use the impeachment and removal power we have given it. If Congress fails to use this power, we won't be able to keep our republic.
Mr. Mason, you are a man of the first order of wisdom, facile in argument, a man of judgment, cogent and persuasive.
South Carolinians have slipped a provision into the draft, Article 7, Section 4, which deprives Congress of the authority to levy a tax on the importation of Africans or to prohibit the importation altogether. Congress must be empowered to tax the importation of slaves or to prohibit their importation.
If that provision stays in the document, I'm leaving I'll join Mr. Mason. Congress has to have the power to regulate this abominable institution, someday to end it, and if not end it entirely, tax it out of existence. I'd rather surrender this document and take my chances with the articles than accede to the South Carolinians' abominable motion.
Slavery is a slow poison, daily contaminating the minds and morals of our people. We lose the dignity of man, which the hand of nature planted in us for great and useful purposes. Mr. Mason?
Mr. Madison? Mr. Madison, will you see what you can do if you go back into Grand Convention?
Yes, we've won the day. The committee has amended the section to authorize the national legislature to tax the importation of slaves, while guaranteeing that the slave trade shall be permitted up until 1808. After that, Congress can and should ban the importation of slavery. The slave trade is a bane.
Mr. Madison, thank you for those kindly words. I'm much relieved.
I'm in complete agreement with your sentiment.
But General, there's one thing that really worries me as the governor of Virginia, and that is we are asking the states to take this document or leave it. There is no process for amending by the ratifying conventions so that they can send their suggestions back to a second convention where we can deliberate on those suggestions.
Mr. Randolph, having again considered your motion, I am forced to conclude that it is not acceptable. The states shall vote up or down on this document, and we will reject the notion of incremental amendment, death by 1,000 cuts.
Let me add that if amendments were permitted, every state would offer a different version. And we would be back in Philadelphia negotiating endlessly, years perhaps, trying to obtain a consensus. Just getting to consensus at this narrow convention with the Virginia plan is difficult enough. You would multiply it logarithmically when you take 13 different proposed series of amendments and try to amalgamate all those in a single document.
Thank you for that. It is unnecessary to argue after I have ruled.
It's important for history, especially judges interpreting the Constitution to know the background.
Well, General, I must apologize. I must take my leave. The proceedings today have so far departed from this Virginia plan, which is all that I am authorized to sign in this convocation, that I, as the governor, have to really be listening to the will of the people who are my client. You understand, sir?
I understand, and I regret the decision and conclusion you've come to, and I would like to speak to you privately, as I may have something on offer for
I
you.
understand that, and I just want you also to know that I think I can be more helpful to you down in Richmond with Mr. Patrick Henry. If I go there as a neutral, not having signed on to this document, and I do look forward to hearing what you might have to say to me later.
You must follow your own counsel, sir.
General?
Take leave.
You brook no compromise, Mr. Mason? No compromise whatsoever? You would sacrifice the good on the altar of the perfect? Have you no sense of how politics works? Have you a sense that you might be wrong?
I sense that the tide has turned in Mr. Hamilton's direction. And if he were here, it would be no question that we would be on the road to monarchy. Thank you, sir, Mr. Madison. We'll talk.
Compromise. You speak of compromise? That's all we've done for the last 5 months, is compromise every single day. I can't go any further. I can't compromise the principles that are sacred to me and the people of Virginia.
Well, I believe that we have a common understanding of what should be sacralized in politics. Our differences are not driven by differences in theories of men, the ordinary depravity of human nature. As the owner of the largest theological library in America, there isn't a man and woman in this room that understands original sin more than I do. What we have attempted here at Philadelphia is to put speed bumps in the road towards ruination based upon depravity, and to prevent the reemergence of kingly monarchical government, as well as majoritarian tyranny, through separation of powers and checks and balances unique in the history of mankind. Think we now would have a judiciary empowered to declare acts of the legislature and the executive and the states unconstitutional. Think of how we've divided the legislative branch between a popularly elected House and a Senate elected at different time intervals and by the state legislatures, giving the president a qualified veto, empowering the Senate to ratify treaties. I could go on ad infinitum, but this is unique in the history of the world. The Constitution we are signing today pits ambition against ambition. It is not based upon reforming the morals of mankind. It's not based upon a war against the DNA. It's trying to diffuse the power arrangements in government to make certain that no one faction dominates or oppresses another. The ultimate goal is justice.
Well, that certainly sounds reasonable, but I humbly disagree. The solution you offer to today's problem is going to create a bigger problem tomorrow. Today's Constitution lays the foundation for a federal government with a single president that will grow and grow and grow more powerful over time and will threaten the very liberties that we seek to protect here in Philadelphia. The presidency will grow like a cancer and spread throughout the constitutional body. We improvidently have made Washington commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He becomes president. And it is true that George, as our first president, would temporarily be security against tyranny. But we will end up with a warfare state where down the road, the warfare state will take over and override the legislative and judicial branches, and they will in turn kowtow to this dominant president. This is my prediction. Every republic in history has been corrupted by the lust of our leaders for power. Ours will be no exception. The convention has gone way too far down this road towards creating a structure that will lead to monarchy and tyranny. It is with deep regret, General Washington, that I must part company with you today. I would rather cut off my right arm than sign this Constitution. Principle is more important to me than friendship. You know not what you do. I bid you farewell and God's blessings.
General, you saved our country once, and I trust you to lead us collectively in saving it again, despite my esteemed comment you just said.
I believe Mr. Randolph would be frightened of his shadow. If man is corrupt and morals as depraved as he suggests, the state governments would have already fallen apart. How could we have won the Revolutionary War unless there were at least some element of altruism and self-sacrifice? The kind that is epitomized by the president here at our convention. Now, with regard to these Cassandran forecasts of an immediate monarchy, let me steal a march on time here. For over 100 years, the system worked as I had contrived it. The separation of powers kept Congress, not the president, in the catbird seat. There are few exceptions only in times of war, but as late as 1888, our esteemed academic then, Woodrow Wilson, was writing about congressional government, not presidential power. Tyranny was nowhere to be seen. All the authorizations, all the temptations that Mr. Mason imputed to the presidency were not there. It wasn't the system that failed. We were not building Taj Mahals and pyramids to some executive branch. If we jump forward now another 70 or 80 years, it's true, today we have now come to a limitless executive with authority to kill any American he wants on his say-so alone. He goes to war on his own. He surveils Americans on his own, the same way that James Otis condemned as early as 1765. Instead of treaties, he acts by executive agreement. When he goes out from the White House, he almost has an entourage as long as the Roman emperor when he walked down the streets of Rome. But that is not because the Constitution has been honored. It is because it has been dishonored. And that's the answer to Mr. Mason. Now, think of anyone else in the history of mankind. I was able to foresee for a century, a full century, how the system would operate. Think today, 100 years from now, who could know all the changes in culture and international affairs that might change the effectiveness of any dispensation at that time? And I think 100 years is a good track record before you start down the path that Mr. Mason certainly advocated. And whatever Mr. Mason thinks, that 100 years brought the United States to the position of power and authority and wealth that enables it today sort of totter on its own.
May I add a word as the purported royalist in this group?
I think so. Welcome back.
We have a president who actually is a great achievement in the sense that his election partially ended the Civil War, which divided our country more than 100 years ago. And this president, hesitatingly, conflictingly, but really has challenged the Congress of the United States to craft a set of war powers which the Congress believes is consistent with the Constitution of the United States. And you know what? This Congress, who by implication my friend is accusing of being pusillanimous and not living up to its constitutional duties, still won't do it. They will not take responsibility under Article 1.
True enough, but your argument, Mr. Hamilton, is totally specious because the proposal that he sent ignores the fact that he continues to claim authority on his own under Article 2 to fight the wars however he wants, in whatever way he wants, without any congressional authority he receives. And so he's asking Congress to buy on politically to what he's doing. So if the war sinks, he now has a co-participant in the sinking.
But if they haul him back to the Constitution, he will obey. But they won't do it.
Yes, I would agree that Congress has become pusillanimous, something that Madison, I could not have conceived. I was writing about the power of the excesses of the legislative branch, which was in ascendancy over 200 years ago.
Gentlemen, I've earlier said that I am a man of action, not a man of words. Pusillanimous, Adam Break, what all these? These are the statements of men of words. And yet for this I am exceedingly grateful, as I have always relied on my instinct, initiative, and training in action. I have relied on my counselors, my colleagues, and my respected friends for my thought. The quality of thought extends and reflects not only the deep gifts of intellect, but in some instances, prescience and even clairvoyance in your remarkable remarks. That said, consensus is not easily had. I appreciate we have not only a high quality of thought, but a high quantity of opinion around the table. And with the authorities invested in me, I bring the Philadelphia Convention to a close.
We will now have questions and answers, and we will deal with the Washington presidency for 8 years. Now, Mr.
If there are any questions on my hobby of fox hunting, I would also answer those as well, technique or theory.
Now, Mr. Hamilton, once Washington got elected and you were Treasury Secretary, you had all kinds of schemes that you, some people say that they wouldn't even join, good people wouldn't even join the administration because Mr. Washington would only listen to you. Now, what did you, I want to ask you a question about the whiskey rebellion. How did you get President Washington to leave Washington and get on a horse with you and go to Philadelphia, go up to Pennsylvania and attack your fellow citizens?
Because those wild men with their stills had been allowed to flout the authority of the federal government, the federal government would have soon broken down. Look, I can argue with you as to whether the whiskey tax was good public policy or not. I know you have strong feelings on the subject. The reason I allowed myself to be appointed to Major General by my esteemed leader and went and efficiently took care of this problem with federal troops was not because of some argument over the rights or wrongs of a whiskey tax. It was to make sure that the rule of law pervaded under our new Constitution.
If I could defend this roguish gentleman here. Remember, at that time, we had no Department of Justice, we had no FBI, we had no IRS agents. The only way to obtain a revenue stream, because an income tax was not possible, is through an excise tax or through import and export revenue. So you're cutting off the entire revenue stream of the federal government, which was needed to repay debts and otherwise function. So what did you expect the President of the United States to do? We couldn't let this go with impunity. I think we already witnessed in Shays' Rebellion in 1786 what the consequences would be for the national economy and the debtor-creditor kind of relationship. So I think you're, again, exaggerating this idea of an executive gone wild.
Now,
I appreciate the wisdom of my friend, Mr. Madison. He's not always been so forthcoming.
I'm surprised you're not from the same state, but Randolph and I are. What about this treaty, this Jay treaty? We sent John Jay over, and he came back with this treaty that basically left us without control of the Mississippi, which makes it obviously tough on our southern president. What's the argument for this? Why, General Washington, after you deliberated long and hard on this, and I think you had some advice on this. What is your advice?
Well, my advice is that
Now you were.
I was the Secretary of State.
Now that's after you became the Attorney General in return for.
It's slightly misleading to say we had no Department of Justice. I was the first Attorney General of the United States, and we respected the rule of law.
And you got that job because you switched your vote on the Constitution.
Well, I helped shepherd
Very wisely.
the Constitution through the Virginia ratifying convention. And
I remain grateful.
yes, and you were very, very grateful.
We agree on that.
But we owe our existence to the help of France. And France was struggling to pursue a democracy. They'd gotten rid of their king just as we've gotten rid of our king. Mr. Hamilton has never given up his love of the British monarchy. And he and Mr. Jay negotiated this treaty without the authorization of the Secretary of State, mind you, or without any approval from Congress.
But why would he need approval from Congress? It's right clear that only the President can negotiate treaties.
No,
if Congress got interfered at that time, it would be a transgression.
No, because the Senate ratifies treaties.
Afterwards,
And
not at the outset.
and this was something that was sprung on the Senate.
Well, number one, all I can say is you're likening Robespierre and Danton to Democrats after the French Revolution. They were not Democrats whatsoever, so why we should be entrusting our fate to these people who are fanatics is beyond me. And aside from the fact that the good things that came of the treaty was the fact that we got the British to remove their troops that were in ever-present danger, like the sword of Damocles, from the forts in the Northwest that we were unable to do under the Treaty of 1783 because we weren't in compliance ourselves, in parts because states weren't recognizing the debts of the British.
Mr. Madison, I'm really quite surprised to see you mouthpiecing Mr. Hamilton's arguments.
Well, I'm delighted that my young friend, Mr. Madison, whose friendship was perhaps a little clouded in the past, has seen such light. And I can only add to his eloquent remarks the following thought. You know, you Southerners, who I love very much, you always think in terms of land and more land. And you borrow lots of money and you buy more land. And then what happens is you need more and more credit, and you need more and more soldiers to defend the land which you have just acquired. The word taken comes to mind, but we won't go there. In my view, before acquiring all sorts of additional land, this country needs to consolidate its power, which only can be done through consolidation of federal credit, extension of credit to private parties who are not just going to acquire more land, but build the sinews of a strong and powerful nation through manufacturing. And once we achieve the sinews of real state power in America, then maybe we can think about getting some more land. But let's always put first things first.
Your idea for the banking industry, Mr. Hamilton, like the single president, is the fetus of monarchical banking.
And let me remind you, someone who drafted the farewell address, that you renounced the idea of debt through President Washington, saying no, that it was unfair and immoral to saddle posterity with debts incurred by a current generation. What caused you to change your mind? Are you like Dave Gergen, who switches like a human weather vane at the turn of every kind of presidential election?
No, Mr. Madison, you misunderstand. I agree with every word that President Washington gracefully put into his great address. However, look what the situation was before. You had 13 so-called sovereign states, each borrowing money up to the hilt, unable to honor their own debts, quarreling among each other as to which pie was going to be divided in which slices. And what I did, and they hated it at the time, is I basically relieved them of all those debts, substituted the full faith and credit of the United States, which had no full faith and credit until I came along. And we, as a sovereign nation, had paid every dime, the principal and interest owed. Yes, some brokers in Philadelphia and elsewhere got rich on the transactions, but you need a market, don't you, Mr. Madison? You believe in markets.
Believe in markets, but I also believe in equity. And you took those bonds from veterans, bought them at a cut rate price, 20 cents, 30 cents, paid back 100 cents on the dollar. That's like bailing out AIG's creditors. Paid back 100 cents on the dollar when they were ready to go bankrupt.
Gentlemen, once again, I have lost the thread of what it is. But in the manner that I see things, I understand there's some larger tension between the dignity, potency, and prospects of a country that expands by land. May I call that akin to what I have personally done? Through marriage, military and acquisition, not without a little help from Dad along the way. And a country that would expand by a uniform set of standards that would modulate the differences among the states and create a system that would allow economic growth, be that through land or through other methods, perhaps using my own beloved Potomac River as an avenue to the west. Would be one fashion of that expansion. This is a tension, but we're philosophically joined by a common underpinning that that foundation must be strong, durable, beyond the capacity of any individual to change. And on that thought, I believe we should pivot to the people who brought us here and take questions from those people. Motion passed.
We have James Otis came down from Boston and is here. If anyone cares about the Fourth Amendment, he can speak to that. You care about the Fourth Amendment? Yes. James, will you tell us about the Fourth Amendment? Why should we care about the Fourth Amendment?
In the 1760s, as a lawyer in Boston, I argued against the writs of assistance. A young lawyer was in the audience of the courthouse that day, a fellow who would later succeed General Washington as the second president of the United States. That fellow was John Adams. Of my argument, Mr. Adams said, Then and there, the child of independence was born. The writs of assistance violated the common law. Writs of assistance were known as the general warrants and were enacted lawfully by the Parliament. They allowed the Commonwealth to search and seize without probable cause, without a judge-issued warrant, and without particularly describing the place and items to be searched or seized. That violated the common law. The Parliament had acted, as I said in the courthouse that day, illegally. Today, we have the Congress acting illegally in violation of the Fourth Amendment that is based on those common law principles that I argued that day in court through warrantless searches. Today, the Commonwealth of Virginia is voting on issuing judgeless, warrantless searches of computer records. And today, Virginia has proposed a 21st century Fourth Amendment that protects digital property. And it would require that all warrants, including administrative subpoenas, be issued only by a judge. So, as I described in the courthouse that day, the government had acted illegally in violation of the law that oversees and rules government. We have that law in the Bill of Rights. It is over the government, and the government cannot violate that law. Today we have an opportunity right here in Virginia. I've come down out of snowy Logan Airport to visit with you all, to return the Fourth Amendment back to its common law roots of a rule of law over government itself.
James Otis, what happens if you lose the Fourth Amendment? What happens to the First?
The Fourth Amendment was instituted to prevent a number of terrible things, including the search and seizure of the printing press. Critics of government, including over in England, were terrorized by their government for criticizing the Crown. Agents of the Crown would come in and remove the printing press of critics of government. So there is a distinct correlation between the right of free speech, the right of the press, and the Fourth Amendment protections. The Fourth Amendment protections protects our houses, persons, papers, and personal effects. So it protects our persons and our private property, but it protects our inalienable rights from trespass and transgressions by government.
If I could add to the James Otis's excellent exposition there, to capture the true spirit of the Fourth Amendment. It was actually a few years prior to your famous speech in 1763 in the British Parliament by William Pitt the Elder, and he was explaining what the gist of that common law was. And he spoke eloquently that the poorest man in his cottage may bid defiance to all the forces of the crown, may be frail, roof may shake, storms may enter, winds may blow through it, the rain may enter, the King of England cannot enter. All his forces dare not cross the threshold of the ruined tenement. That's the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. Now, as we sit here today, everyone in this room has had, since May of 2006, your telephony metadata on every single call you've ever been involved in, domestic or international. You make 20 calls a day, it's probably like 4,000 or 5,000. All the metadata, the call that you're making, the number you're dialing from, the number you call, the date of the call, the duration of the call, the location of the call, is collected by the National Security Agency without any warrant based upon any suspicion whatsoever. And it collects it and keeps it there. It searches from time to time to think, you know, maybe you'll be connected to a telephone number that the NSA thinks is connected to an international terrorist organization. Now, it's true we've had now 9 years, and with that collection, they've foiled 0 domestic terrorism plots, yet they continue to move forward. Despite the revelations of Mr. Snowden, Congress, our great pusillanimous, cowardly institution, has done nothing to pare back the statutory authority that purports to justify this massive invasion of our privacy. And in June of this year, that statutory authority will lapse unless it's continued. It's up to us to ensure that our members don't continue it, which at present is going to be an uphill challenge. But we really hardly even have a Fourth Amendment anymore. And John, you were talking about the implication for free speech. Well, how open are we when we think everything we say over the phone or the internet will be in the hands of the government? How fooling will it be to criticize the government? Some of the litigation has involved situations where reporters can't get people to talk to them. They can't do the reporting because they're worried anything they say will be picked up by the government of the United States.
There's a good lawyer in the United States by the name of Fitzgibbons who wrote 2 weeks after September 1, suggesting a sunset provision on what was later to become the Patriot Act. And right now, as my friend Mr. Madison says, we face an opportunity to turn back these unlawful acts of the Congress and return our inalienable rights to the proper position of requiring a judge to issue a warrant after probable cause, particularly describing the place and the items to be searched or seized.
Would Mr. Otis offer a similar analysis of civil forfeiture?
He would indeed. Civil forfeiture involves the appropriation of private property by our police departments. Our Fifth Amendment requires due process of law to protect life, liberty, and property. Our Sixth Amendment requires a jury trial. Civil forfeiture violates both the Fifth and Sixth Amendment. When an individual has an opportunity to be heard before a court of justice and before a jury of his peers, then his assets may be seized at law, but not prior to that.
We have a couple of questions. David, you gentlemen, David, I want to say, David, stand up. David has more, you have 18 clients in Guantanamo, and you've gone 100 times. You've been to Guantanamo more than anyone, and you have represent the rights of Guantanamo inmates. So just so that you understand how seriously David takes the Constitution.
Well, fittingly, this is a question about habeas corpus. You gentlemen cared so much about the right of habeas corpus that you put it in the Constitution itself, not in the Bill of Rights. And not only that, but you put the power to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus in the legislative article of the Constitution. 407 years later, one of your successors unilaterally suspended the writ of habeas corpus, Mr. Lincoln. Do you believe that his action in doing so was consistent with the Constitution? If he had asked you for your advice, what would you have said? And if you had said he had not the power to do this, would you have accepted the consequences of a division of the Union?
Well, Mr. Madison, I'm sure that you have a very cogent and remarkable answer to that question. And before you give it, I might say that we appreciate you coming around. We're willing to call you the father of the Constitution, but your claim to being the father of the Bill of Rights, Edmund and I cough a little on that.
That's certainly Mr. Mason.
So does John Adams.
We wanted amendments, and we wanted amendments before we agreed. I mean, we recently had a health care bill passed, and the head of Congress, the House of Representatives said that if you want to find out what's in it, pass it, and then you'll find out. That's not theory. We operated on. We wanted to know what we're getting into before we get into it. You did not want amendments, but the balance of power shifted and it moved on to doing the Bill of Rights. So we want to compliment you on your flexibility as General Washington had flexibility. You had supreme flexibility. And so tell us about the Bill of Rights. David's question.
Well,
First,
first, I would quarrel with the word flexibility. I just follow Abraham Lincoln's wisdom that a man who doesn't grow wiser by the day is a fool. It's not flexibility. It's learning, refinement. You can always make an error. The error is human, to forgive is divine. Now, what about the writ of habeas corpus? President Lincoln did suspend the writ. It was challenged in ex parte merriment, as you well know, before Chief Justice Roger Taney in Maryland, where it was used to detain someone who was blocking the troops from traveling from the north into Washington, D.C. Roger Taney was the author of the infamous, odious Dred Scott decision declaring that blacks could never be citizens of the United States, whether they were free or not. He was not friendly to Mr. Lincoln, but in any event, he ruled that the president lacked authority to suspend the writ of habeas corpus unilaterally. Mr. Lincoln disobeyed the decree, but he didn't hide that. He immediately went to Congress. Congress, as you know, when the Civil War erupted, was not in session. This was July 4th, 1861, and he explained what he had done. He asked for Congress to ratify what he had done, which he did. And he raised this question of whether a government was necessarily either too strong for the liberties of its people or too weak to protect itself from collapse. And he said the immediate duty and urgency upon him was to keep the Constitution in place, which was not going to happen if the federal government was overthrown. But I think that President Lincoln did the right thing. He didn't act in some sense unilaterally because he explained that Congress could impeach him if they thought that he had acted illegally, and Congress did ratify what he had done retroactively. Ultimately, I think the Supreme Court did hold, in an opinion by Chief Justice Chase, that only Congress could suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which was eventually used in part by our Supreme Court in 2008 to hold that the writ of habeas corpus did extend to detainees at Guantanamo.
I'd be permitted to comment. As you all know, I'm the one foreigner in this group. I was born in St. Croix to, shall we say, challenged parents. And I came to America as an immigrant and am very grateful for the education and the benefits I received. And that gratitude lasted my whole life, and I feel it fiercely. But it gives me a slightly different perspective on this question of habeas corpus in the context of my time. A number of Americans, and frankly, both of our political parties, but if I may say so, more the Republican than the Democrat, although this isn't strictly a partisan point of view, have taken the attitude that it is important that the enemy combatants in Guantanamo not be afforded even the flicker of dignity as U.S. citizens, because they know that if Pollyannish judges, like some of the judges to which my esteemed colleague has referred, were given the opportunity, they might take seriously America's ratification of various international conventions, such as the Geneva Accords and others, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, and say that merely because a person is not a U.S. citizen does not mean that the United States can exercise its great power against that person, irrespective of observance of the basic human rights that are afforded to people who are citizens. Now, I raise this issue because I think it's important that we think in this frame. Is it possible for the United States Constitution to survive in letter and in spirit if we insist, rather tribally, on limiting its benefits to people who are narrowly defined as citizens of the United States? And as someone who came from St. Croix and who has deep gratitude to this country for taking me in, I respectfully submit that the answer to that question is no.
But Mr. Hamilton, you've misread my document. The Constitution protects persons, not including citizens, but also those who are immigrants, which is exactly why, in the Boumediene decision, the writ of habeas corpus is extended to detainees, whether they're citizens or not. And that is black letter constitutional law for well over a century.
Thank you. And let me use my prerogative to say that I cannot help but note that whereas others at this table debate the paternity of the Constitution and the paternity of the Bill of Rights, you, sir, are the first to debate your own paternity. A rare act of candor.
I do that in all humility to make a point.
But let me also speak to the question of the fall very briefly to say, theory aside, it strikes me that the Constitution may be read as an end in itself, or it may be read as a birth certificate, a certain form of country culture and politics. And it is not to be read as a suicide pact among its membership. This Abraham Lincoln fellow you speak of may have been a wartime president. I predict he will be a wartime president. Why? Because I am accustomed to war. War is not an ideal birthplace for any system. However, this republic shall not be a republic known for being at war if it is to follow my simple dictate of avoiding foreign entanglements and pursuing a process that we have so carefully crafted here that it is difficult for unilateral executive action to lead to war. If I may make one prediction, it is that this republic will be free of the European burden of constant war. If I am wrong, don't tell me. Thank you.
Frank Buckley, stand up. Frank is a professor at George Mason, the university named after me. Frank got me really into Mason and his role. And Frank's written a brilliant book called Once the Future King, The Rise of the Crown Government of America. And Frank, do you have copies here?
I have, and we can perform a capital stat.
And you may, why don't you give us your thesis?
You have to buy the book for that, but let me just say this. There are some people here of perhaps a certain age who can remember a television program that began, there are 8 million stories in the naked city. Does that ring a bell? Some people. I want to mention 2 stories. 2 people. One of them isn't in the room, wasn't in Philadelphia. You can imagine him up there in the gallery. His name is Sir Guy Carleton, later Lord Dorchester, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces, New York, 1783. Now he's stationed in Montreal. A few years later, he holds an army in readiness. He expects shortly an outbreak of war. He holds all of the Ohio Valley in his hands. And I say all that because we can too easily, from the benefit of today, imagine that it had to turn out just as it did, whereas the Constitution was a near-run thing. It very nearly didn't happen. It happened because of necessary compromises. But there were points where there were near walkouts. There were points where some people said they were going to hang other delegates, right? Where they predicted a civil war. All of that happened. We just assumed it was going to turn out right. And the other person was here, but never too much to be praised, George Mason. I'll tell you a little bit about George Mason and Virginia history. Now, we all know the only thing of interest pretty much in American history happened right here in Virginia, right? Right? And if it happened elsewhere, as in Philadelphia, it was only because some Virginia boys came visiting, right? Those stories from Philadelphia, there were 53 delegates in the room at any one time, there might have been 30, 35 max. They went up to New York, they did other things. But one of the stories is George Mason, and I always read the debates as the tragedy of George Mason, because almost nobody spoke more than he did, even after he thought the thing was gone. Right? He was number 3 in the list of speakers. Right at the end, he kept trying to shape it. And he didn't think it would work out well.
It was those damn committees.
I know, yeah. But you know, when you think about independence, right, when did we declare ourselves independent of the British? Was it July 4? Was it July 2? Well, if you're in Virginia, it was June 11th, because that was the day in which George Mason's Declaration of Rights was approved in the House of Delegates in Richmond, and that stated that we were independent. If you're a Virginian, that's when it happened, right? So, in a way, it's the tragedy of George Mason, one of the greatest of the framers, but someone who couldn't sign it right at the end, and in failing to do so, lost the friendship of his great friend, George Washington.
And that
You've done good, George.
Thank you, Professor. And,
These books can be bought.
thank you, Professor. One question in the backbench. You're welcome to allow the last question today.
All our founders spoke highly of the virtuous teacher. And I have not heard the word virtue spoken today. Now, fortunately, in our time, we have an uncorrupt legislature and a virtuous executive. But there was a time when I believe it was you, President Madison, who wrote Benjamin Rush and said, if a man should ogle a woman lasciviously, how can a republic stand? With that in mind, when virtue evaporates, or when one man's virtue is another man's vice, how can a republic stand?
It
No, and moreover, I think I was the one in the Federalist Papers that denied some of the more gloomy assessments of human nature, and thinking that empowering any federal government would instantly yield corruption and tyranny. And I think I was proven true for at least 100 years. But ultimately, the founders were not naive. They knew, and the first item in President Washington's first State of the Union address was, we need an educated, enlightened public, because their attitudes will find their imprint upon the legislation and policy and morals of the country. And without that, the country will go off of a cliff. Now, unfortunately, I think over time, our civic education, education in general, has plunged, and we no longer have that gratitude and respect and understanding that the glory of the United States is liberty, the march of the United States is the march of the mind. Look at our icons today, and they're travesty what those ideals are.
On that positive note, I would like to make a personal remark that it is a privilege to be back here in what I think of as my eponymous town. I was last here in 1749 to survey the land, and as I survey the contents of this room, I gently differ and think that human progress is possible. One generation has been replaced by another generation, and another generation, and another generation. And things need not be perfect to enable that forward flow of humanity. Those being my observations, this meeting is adjourned.